Good evening. It's such a pleasure to be here to introduce to you this remarkable book that I'm excited to talk more about and to ask Naseer Sahab his impressions about and to get the inside goss on its writing from Moin about. Thank you all for being here. Delhi publishers are sometimes wont to say that, oh, book events in Bombay are so sparsely attended. And I usually say, yeah, that's because if you can do a book event that's as fun as actually reading a book, we'll show up. And we will do our best to give you just a flavor of what makes The Lost Fragrance of Infinity so special. Let me not do that by beginning, by diving into a conversation right away, but instead by asking Naseer Sahab to give us a flavor of the book by reading from the introduction. So a kind of cold open, if you will.
Hello, is it working? Can you hear me? Yes? So this is two brief passages from the introduction of the book. In the latter half of the 17th century, a lost battle and two deaths would be the three events that signaled the beginning of the end of three great empires that spanned from Budapest in Europe to Bengal in India. Over time, not only would their territories shrink, but the radiance of their cultural realms would diminish in luster. The Ottoman defeat at the gates of Vienna in 1683, the death of Shah Abbas II, the Safavid king of Persia in 1666, and the assassination of Dara Shikoh, the crown prince of Mughal India in 1659, would sow the seeds for declining Sufi influence in the intellectual theaters of these empires. Sufism represented the inward, esoteric, and mystical side of Islam. The philosophy of self-examination, compassion, and immersion in divine love made the Sufi curious, scientifically innovative, and spiritually magnetic. The khanqahs of the Sufis were bastions of knowledge, where the study of philosophy, mathematics, mysticism, art, craft, and science flourished. In these khanqahs, young Sufis were guided by their murshids, their teachers, about their role in this world, worship of the divine, and the concept of khidmat-e-khalq, the selfless service to mankind. And from the introduction, the third death that Moin talks about is what I would like to read a piece from concerning Dara Shikoh. No, there is another. I'll read about Dara Shikoh later. But I'll read the piece that Moin asked me to read.
Yes.
Which is also from the introduction. It's about Ibn Sina, who's known as Avicenna in the West. Ibn Sina developed new theories on existence. He unflinchingly believed in one God and was driven to understand Islam as a philosophy. His stupendous philosophical achievement was the painstakingly articulated distinction between essence and existence. Essence could be present but not necessarily bring about existence. He created the concept of the necessary existent that did not need a cause. The necessary existent had to exist. In his analysis of the body and soul, he innovated a new theory according to Ibn Sina. The soul in all animals was full of desire and closely bound to the body. In the human soul, though, there was the extra powerful dimension of understanding and knowledge. The knowledgeable and understanding part of the human soul was the intellect, and it was indestructible even after death.
Amazing. Thank you, Naseer Saab, and thank you, Moin, for writing those words. This is a novel that displays a truly extraordinary breadth of learning and has these really deep philosophical underpinnings, of which you got a little flavor through Naseer Saab's reading. But it's also a page turner, and I hope we can convey the flavor of that to you as the conversation goes on. But before we get into the kind of the whys and whats and who's of the thing, Moin, do you want to talk a little bit about this philosophical underpinning and, just how do these pillars of Sufism, which envision the world as a better place, make their way into this novel, into this grand adventure?
Thank you. Can you hear me? I'm the only one without a hand mic. Thank you, Naseer Saab, for taking the time and reading my work, and taking the time to be here, Supriya for being here, and all of you fine folks for braving Bombay traffic and smog and coming here. I'd also like to take a special moment to thank my daughter, my younger daughter Zoha, who's made it here all the way from Woodstock. So thank you. The reason why I wrote this book from a philosophical point of view was because we've all encountered Sufism at some point in our life. We've probably heard a qawwali, or we've visited a shrine. We've tied a thread, and by and large, those wishes have come true. I've done that. I still do it. But the philosophical depth of Sufism remains relatively unknown, and it kind of sank, if you wish, with the decline of these three empires and a void that was created, which was then filled by Wahhabism, which burst out of a country called Saudi Arabia. And as I was growing up under the tutelage of my grandfather, who was a practicing Sufi, and might I hasten to add here, I'm not a Sufi, but I was brought up by a practicing Sufi, I saw his withdrawal, not necessarily a retreat into isolation. He didn't go and build a little hut on a mountain and withdraw from society, but it was an internal withdrawal of sorts. And when I would question him, and I would address him as Dada Huzur, when I would question him, the one thing that he would always say, you're hearing the qawwali, you're listening to these wonderful singers, but Moin Mir falsafa padho, which means basically read the philosophy. And that stayed with me. And he would hand me these books of these giants called Ibn al-Arabi and Ibn Sina that Naseer Saab spoke about.
We should tell the audience that all of this is happening in Bombay.
Yeah. It's all
in this city.
It's all happening in Kulava, in a building called Bella Court. And so, the initial reaction was reluctance, because my grandfather was a keen tennis enthusiast. He would come with me to a tennis match and encourage me to play tennis, and then he would go to Jhansi Castle, which was this building which still exists in Cooperage, and give a lecture on Ibn Sina and Aristotle with me holding a tennis racket in my hand. And I'd be wondering, what on earth am I doing here? As I started understanding him more and reading him and reading his works, I realized that Sufism, as a philosophy, stands lost today, as a voice of compassion, as a voice of reason, and as a voice of understanding what it is to be and exist. And these incredible giants like Ibn al-Arabi and Ibn Sina that we talk about were inspired by Aristotle, by these Greek philosophers, by the Upanishads, most importantly by the Upanishads. And the pillars that they came up with, to answer your question, are three pillars. I mean, there were many pillars. There were close to 50 pillars, but the three pillars that I talk about in the book is Tawheed, which is oneness, one creator and one mankind, regardless of anything. Takhliq ba ishq, which is creation through love. Takhliq is creation and ishq is love. And the other one is tasawwuf, which is understanding that you as man are the greatest creation, but you're also nothing. As has been proved by today's advances in science and technology, where the fungi are far more intellectual than us. And then the last pillar, which was ishq, purely in a standpoint of understanding how you can fall in love with God and not fear God. So these were the 4 or 5 pillars that I've addressed in the book.
Right. It's one thing to be able to tell us about it with this extraordinary clarity that you have, and quite another to tell it in a book whose pages I couldn't stop turning, as I'm sure was the case for Naseer Saab when you read it. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about using this novel as a vehicle for philosophy? How did you get us to to whip through the book in a frenzy?
I'm not an academic. I studied communication and I studied writing. And I very quickly realized that if I had to write about the likes of Ibn al-Arabi or Hafiz, I would have to do it from a standpoint of a writer rather than an academic. And the one thing that struck me was that all of the, and I'm just giving one example, all of these well, not all of them, but 3 of them had fallen madly in love. Ibn al-Arabi was in love with a beautiful woman called Nizam. Hafiz fell in love with a woman called Shakh-e-Nabat, which in Farsi means a branch of sugar cane. And it's an unimpeachable truth that Rumi and Shams Tabriz shared a very intimate relationship. But it's not the poetry and the philosophy that emerges or bursts through because of that discovery of love is for the love of the creator, the originator, the first mover who remains unmoved, that is God. And they use the arched eyebrow of a woman or the hazel eyes of a woman to fall in love with God, because that's how helpless they become. And so I've used those metaphors to craft a novel of love.
Right. As the culture that you speak about, the qawwalis and the poetry that is so much a part of the heritage of everyone listening to you in this room also do, right? So in some sense, it's using the novel form in the way the poets used poetry, and that's really remarkable. I want to spend just a little bit more time on another aspect of this philosophical underpinning, and that is love and ishq in particular. Would you like to tell us a little bit about one of the things that this novel does, as we will reveal to you as we go on, is draw this really fine line between love and passion and progress and innovation. And that seems like a terribly modern idea, but this is a book where the action starts in the mid 18th century. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, I set my character in the mid 18th century because I realized that if I could flip him over, then I could take the reader right into 9th century and then bring them back into the 18th century as well. What made the Sufis very different was that while they were men of faith, deep men of faith, they did not divorce themselves from faith. The actual the name of Rumi, his real name is Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi. He was a man of deep faith. But what made him different was that he had a curious, imaginative mind. And he could foray into spaces which we can only aspire to understand. Quite like Omar Khayyam, and as I write in the introduction, it becomes very difficult to write about a mind that invents modern-day cubic equations and also writes the Rubaiyat, which is a poetry of deep divine love. It's almost impossible to address that. But the reason I could I humbly try and pay homage and do justice to it, is because I was able to understand that I could look for a metaphor a piece of art, poetry, or a thought that could become a metaphor to kind of show that burst of curiosity and inquisitiveness. There was a gentleman called Abdul Rahman al-Sufi who lived in 9th century Persia, deeply inspired by an Indian mathematician called Brahmagupta. And Brahmagupta was the gentleman who invented the concept of zero. And Abdul Rahman al-Sufi is inspired by him, and he flings himself into astronomy after having studied the Quran and the Upanishads and all of that. And he is the first guy to identify the Andromeda galaxy. And there's a crater on the moon that the International Space Agency has named Al-Sufi. And the largest asteroid is called Al-Sufi as well. So that's the kind of curiosity and fertility of mind that takes them into ishq, love, looking at the beauty of a woman, relating it to God, falling in love with God, creating cubic equations, and discovering an Andromeda galaxy.
Right.
You know? So,
Right. Discovery is what you owe to the creator who made
Exactly.
all of this,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you for explaining that beautifully. I think we should take our readers into the action of the story, though. Naseer Saab, should we read? Would you like to read perhaps about Dara Shikoh, just so that we can drop them right into Shah Jahanabad?
I wasn't a very good student in school, and Dara Shikoh was vaguely mentioned in the history books. So I didn't really know anything about him, but after reading this, it was a heartbreaking passage. And if Dara Shikoh had succeeded the Mughal throne instead of Aurangzeb, I'm sure the history of this country would have been quite different. Born on the 30th of August 1659, 7 years before the death of Shah Abbas of Persia, Dara Shikoh, the crown prince of the Mughal Empire, lay on the damp floor of a dark dungeon. Dara rose, held the iron bars of a small window and looked outside. It was a thunderous monsoon night. A few drops splashed on his face. The wind whistled sharp. There was a sense of impending danger. From the crevice in the door, he saw an approaching candlelight. The light was soon eclipsed by shadows. The door flung open. Men hustled in, the henchmen sent by his brother Aurangzeb. Dara's life flashed before him. The vast and diverse landscape of India was the ideal pasture grounds for this deep-thinking crown prince. Dara thought of the days he sat, legs folded under him, listening attentively to Moin Mir, his Sufi master, in his Khanqa retreat at Lahore. Surrounded by wild deer that bounded around the Khanqa, the Sufi spoke to the prince. The master's words molded the prince's character. He thought of how Moin Mir's teaching of universal love for all faiths had made him interested in the great religion of Hinduism. Dara developed a thirst to know more about the Upanishads. On the banks of the shimmering waters of the Ganges in 1640, Dara assembled the greatest Hindu intellectuals and sannyasi ascetics to translate the Upanishads into Persian. He did not want the Upanishads concealed from the Muslims of India. He titled, which was another reason for him undertaking the translation, he titled the translation of Upanishads Sirri Akbar, the hidden book. The greatest secret. Sirri means secret and Akbar naturally means great. Furthermore, he boldly went on to state that the work referred to in the Quran as the Kitab al-Maknoon, the hidden book, is none other than the Upanishads itself. Not satisfied, Dara would go on to translate the Yoga Vashisht and the Bhagavad Gita into Persian.
Thank you. So that drops you right in the middle of the action, more or less. But there's a real Odysseus of a hero who's the journeyman who takes your hand as a reader and leads you through these amazing events and these historical personalities who cross the pages. And Moin, could you introduce our audience to Qarar Ali? He's a fascinating polymath of a man and also the embodiment of like all the things that you're interested in. Tell us a little bit about him.
Well, while I was writing, or not even writing, I think while I was thinking about this book and how I should address this great philosophy of Sufism, I quickly realized that I would need to create a character that is relatable, that is vulnerable to changes, like we all are. Someone who's human, someone who's easily broken, and someone who takes time to be remade again. And so Qarar Ali is set in 1738 Delhi, when the Mughal Empire is declining. News.
Right. Dara is gone.
Dara is gone. Dara is long gone. Muhammad Shah Rangila is on the throne, on the peacock throne in Delhi. And oddly enough, although the Mughal Empire is very weak, there's a resurgence or a renaissance of sorts which is emerging. And a new language is coming to the fore called Urdu. It's spearheaded by some fantastic poets, Sauda, Dard, Mir. And within this environment is this craftsman who's given to art, who's given to love, and who's influenced by the works of the Sufis. He's not a practicing Sufi, but he's influenced by it. And he lives in these tumultuous times where the Mughal Empire is weakening, there's threat on the borders, and he's also found love. He's redeemed himself as the chosen hand of the emperor to build new monuments. And so while he's kind of found it all, he hasn't quite found the trust of his parents, and that becomes or his father basically. That becomes the kind of contentious point, and so that's the setting in which Qarar Ali is born.
There, and a setting that you described so vividly. Qarar Ali's family lives in a house called Hunarabad, which means the abode of skill. Right? Gosh, I know. I just lingered in those passages. Didn't you find that the Shahjahanabad of this book was so vividly recreated, and you kind of wanted to live in it?
Absolutely. I have some childhood associations with Purani Delhi, with Gali Qasim Jan and Chandni Chowk and so on. And I was just astounded at the level of imagination that Moin was able to summon up to describe Shahjahanabad of those days and to describe the Delhi of those days. It was like taking a trip in a time machine.
I felt the same way. And to bring it out in beauty and vividness while also talking about the cataclysm that befalls it. Because you also throw us into the middle of the sack of Delhi by Nader Shah. And Qarar, that's the thing that kicks off Qarar's astonishing journey. Qarar's journey takes him from Shahjahanabad, where the novel begins, all the way to what seems like the end of the world. This is not a spoiler, and I don't think we should be talking about literature in terms of spoilers anyway. The novel takes him all the way to Spain, and we'll talk a little bit more about the journey over this conversation. But that is a really vast geography to traverse. And one of the many things that kind of forms a thread through this is a particular art form, and that is gire, or tile work. Those of you who have been to Delhi will instantly know what I'm talking about when I say the word style work, because you'll think of Humayun's tomb or some of the monuments of Old Delhi. Moin, can you take us a little bit more, can you take us through the details of what this art is and what it represents and the role it plays in your novel?
So Gira in Farsi means...
Thank you for not correcting my pronunciation.
No. Gira in Farsi means a knot. The Sufis in Isfahan and in Central Asia came up with this fantastic geometric art form called Gira tile making. And this burst into the Middle East. It then found its way into Turkey and then into Andalusia. And it also finds its way into Delhi in India. And while I was wanting to build this character who's sensitive and who's a craftsman, I was looking for a metaphor through which I could tell that story. And it was by sheer luck that I visited this monument in Delhi called Dilkusha, which has been identified by arguably one of our greatest historians of our time, called William Dalrymple. It's a beautiful little monument called Dilkusha, and when I went there, I was struck by those blue tiles that kind of embrace the entire facade of that monument. And the precision of the geometric pattern there is astounding. You have squares, pentagons, triangles, all interlocking into a knot called the Gira. And as I took this so-called tile trail, if you wish, you take it from Delhi and you go into Samarkand, and then you go. I couldn't go to Iran because of the situation there. Neither could I visit Afghanistan. But we went from Delhi to Samarkand, and then we flung ourselves into Anatolia, which is the landmass of Turkey. And we worked our way into Bursa, and then into Andalusia. And that's when I realized that I had this ribbon that I could link it with. But it wasn't until I, by chance, spent an afternoon in this town called Bursa, which lies overshadowed by Istanbul. And there's only one gleaming mosque in Bursa, which outshines every mosque in the world in terms of tile work, called the Yesel Kami Mosque. And I went in there and I saw I think it was about 8 in the morning. My wife had refused to come with me. She refused to leave Istanbul. So I took this car drive and I landed up in Bursa. And I went in, it was silent, it was quiet. Slanting sunbeams were flowing through the stained glass windows. And there was this man sitting alone, twirling his prayer beads, this old Sufi. And he ran these workshops of tile makers. He didn't speak a word of English, but one of his assistants did. And during my conversation with him, I'm trying to cut the long story short, he said, "Look at these tiles, what do you see?" And I didn't have an answer. I said, I see a square, I see a pentagon, I don't know. And he said, no, these are the different races of mankind. These are the different people, the different languages. And if you interlock them, and that's when mankind will rise and seek enlightenment. And right in the middle of that, they put a 8-pointed star, which is the star of enlightenment. And those tiles are all across the mihrab, which is where the prayers are offered. And they go all the way, and they're called the tiles of infinity. And that's when I knew that I had a character who would be the tile maker.
I think one of the many successes of this novel is how immersively Moin is able to write about the artistry of this tile work and the artistry that his protagonist, our hero Karar Ali, practices. And since we had both Moin, a writer, and Naseer Saab, who is a writer and an actor here, I kind of wanted to ask them both a general question, which is that to me it seems enormously difficult to talk about an art form in another art form. They say that about writing about music is like dancing about architecture. But you've both done this in your practice. You've both grappled with this, dealing with with artists who work in other media, thinkers from other times. What is that like? How do you address that challenge?
Actors pretend. It's as simple as that. I think it takes a million times more effort to produce a written work than do an acting job. It is said that acting is perhaps the most pleasurable and easiest profession in the world. But I admire writers more than I admire actors, because as a writer, to get into the shoes of a character requires far more painstaking research and a vaster knowledge than you need as an actor. As an actor, you're provided the material. You have to simulate truth. As a writer, you've got to delve into it. You've got to be able to understand it. When I play a character, I don't need to understand him. In fact, I'd never be able to. If I tried to understand Ghalib, how far do you think I'd get, you know? Or if I tried to understand Einstein, I wouldn't get far. It's enough for me to understand the situation these characters are in and to be able to empathize emotionally with their situation. So it's far easier than being a writer.
I can't believe that, because the page allows you to make infinite mistakes, right? But that's a very generous way of looking at it. Moin, where do you come in on this?
For me, as a writer, it's always been the human element, not the dry stuff, not preaching, not standing on a pedestal and telling my reader that this is my opinion and this is what I want you to think. But when I finish my book or an article, I'd like to finish it by giving the reader something to think about and relate to it and think about it in a more humane way, rather than putting out an opinion piece or putting out something which is more which is forceful. For me, it is about sentiment, it's about emotion, and it's about what makes it more human.
So let me again, related to that, let me again ask both of you: is there a spiritual element to how you practice art?
In acting, it's very. I'm very skeptical about what spiritualism in acting. Acting is labor, just as writing is. And I've only written one book, which was about my own life, but I had to work very hard at it, harder than I've ever worked on any part I've played. And the whole business of acting talent being granted to some person by nature is nonsense. I don't believe in that at all. I think your talent is commensurate with the amount of effort you put in, because nature doesn't discriminate to grant one person a lot of talent and another person none at all. That's not at all the case. And I'm very wary about getting into metaphysical territory where acting is concerned. But I dare say it is different for a writer. And I'd be very interested to hear Moin's opinions on that.
It is laborious. Writing is utterly laborious. There are moments when one has the thought, but one isn't able to kind of feel it in the fingertips and even execute it in terms of a thought on your screen or on paper. But there have been, I wouldn't use the word spiritual, because I agree with Naseer Saab that there's probably not necessarily a spiritual experience, but there have been moments of inspired intuition. And an inspired intuition could emerge from a mental space that you're inhabiting at a particular point. And that could then infiltrate into your character. And I, with all due, very humbly, I don't agree with writers who say that there is never a part of them in a particular lead character or in a character. There is always a little bit of you that is going in. There is always an element, and I think every writer has an element of him going in, and to deny that, I think, is not being true to your craft. So there are elements of me that have gone into my books, but I've not had spiritual moments, but I've had moments of inspired intuition that have taken that character or the plot forward.
So kind of
I'd like to. I'm not by no means an authority on Ghalib, though people compliment me by saying that we think of Ghalib, we think of you, which is a pretty big burden to carry, I can tell you. But there's a couplet by him which I wouldn't recite in the original because it's very complex. But what it says is, these thoughts come to me from the ether. It is the sound of my pen, which is the voice of the angels. Yeah. You just have to sit down and go at it. Yeah.
The angels through the sound of the scratch.
The inspiration doesn't strike an unprepared person.
Thank you for saying that. And that kind of brings us nicely to one of the successes of what Moin accomplishes, which is to take you into the mindset of a person for whom work is spiritual and religious, though in this incredibly heterodox way. And I think it would be great to hear from the book again. Naseer Saab, would you like to read?
Yes, I would love to. I'd read the whole book out.
We'd love to hear you. But any passage you'd like.
This is a description of the funeral of the great 13th century Sufi Fariduddin Attar, who wrote The Conference of the Birds, which is a highly philosophical book, though it sounds like a children's story to some. And I'll read in between, it's just a brief piece. The old man pulled out a miniature painting from his cloth bag. This was Behzad's cataclysmically melancholic work, The Burial of the great 13th century Sufi Fariduddin Attar. Attar had written the famous poem Conference of the Birds, in which he told the story of each bird's quest to find the king of birds, the mythical Simurgh. To find their king, the birds had to undertake an arduous flight to the mountain Tar. On reaching the mountain, they discovered an inward realization that the best resided in each one of them, and it was actually the search to understand themselves which was more important than finding a king. Attar, an elderly man of 80, was captured and then murdered by the all-slaying Mongols in 1225. Behzad had painted his burial with great emotion. A man wearing a blue robe had ripped it in mourning, had ripped the painting in mourning. But what Behzad did in the middle of the painting signified love and defiance. He painted a tree rising from the middle of the painting. A tree without leaves, almost lifeless, signified winter and Attar's death. But as if urging the eyes of the interested to climb branch by branch, at the topmost branch, he painted a little nest. The nest had 2 small eggs and 2 birds perched on a branch next to it, and at the bottom of the tree was the slain Attar's grave. To anyone with a fertile imagination, Behzad had communicated what he felt. A Sufi could be physically murdered, but his philosophy of love would always find new life.
Isn't that amazing? And isn't it such a beautiful representation of how art kind of bridges what is material about our world and what is unseen and intangible, but no less real? I want to ask you something very broad, which is, and I think we've also given our listeners a sense of just how vast the journey that this book takes us on is. Is there a way that we can tell them about this, just about the journey that Karar Ali goes on and how that's both external and internal? A flavor of that, perhaps, Moin?
Catastrophe strikes when you expect it least. And there's a point in the protagonist's life when he seems to believe that he has it all. Life is reasonably all right. He's been reading philosophy and all of that, but he's relatively unaware of what's lying in wait for him. And that's the invasion of the Persian king into India in 1739 by Naseeruddin Shah. And that really breaks the back of India in many ways. It breaks the back of Mughal India, decisively. There are moments that where people say it kind of tries to crawl back between 1739 and 1850s, but it never really does.
1757 is not far, right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the destruction of Delhi, where Nader Shah slaughters 30,000 innocent men and women. Every time I go to Delhi, I try and picture myself walking down those streets with blood, and it speaks to me even today. It talks to me. The ghosts are still there, and this is carnage at an unprecedented level, in which the character finds himself, and he loses everything. He loses his family. He loses the one connection to the divine, which is his ishke majazi to the ishke hakiki, which is Abira. And that becomes the moment in time when he's rudderless. And there is a question within him in terms of existence. Is this really worth continuing? He contemplates suicide. He does all kinds of things, and without giving too much away, he's taken onto this journey from Delhi into Samarkand and then beyond, which in many ways becomes an inward journey to rebuild. He encounters torn down monuments which are made of brick and mud, and he starts associating his torn down life with those monuments and with those broken walls. But with the acquired skill of restoration, he starts restoring mud brick walls, slowly graduates into restoring tile work, and that becomes a metaphor for a restoration of life. And through that journey, a misty path of redemption and a misty path of rebuilding appears.
Wonderfully summarized. I have many more questions, but I will ask you one more before perhaps we can bring the audience into the conversation and hear from Naseer Saab once again. You mentioned Abira, who is to me the heroine of this novel in many ways. And this novel, which takes place so much in the mind and the journey of this one man, Karar Ali, is really bookended by two extraordinary women who are brilliant characters in themselves, but also kind of representations of this transformation that happens to Karar Ali, right? Would you give us just a little introduction to Abira and to Catalina?
Yeah.
And induce our audience to read the book immediately.
Thank you. With Naseer Saab's permission, might I read a little poem? Is that all right? Of course. And I think that's the best way to introduce Abira into this space now, and also talk very quickly about what I briefly mentioned, which is ishke majazi leading up to ishke hakiki. a large number of Sufi poetry which gets circulated in the name of Rumi and the likes today on WhatsApp is actually not their poems, and also not what the poet wanted to communicate. Indeed, the likes of Ibn al-Arabi and Hafiz were madly in love with women. But Ishq-e-Majazi is the love for the created, which in turn makes them helplessly fall in love with the originator or the first mover who remains unmoved, which is God. And the way I'd like to introduce Abira is through this poem that Qarar Ali reads out to Abira, which is a poem by Ibn al-Arabi, which was written when Ibn al-Arabi was in Mecca and fell in love with Nizam, a woman that made him actually fall in love with God. And the verse goes quite like this. Sorry, bear with me a second. Yeah. In one such letter to Abira, Qarar quoted Ibn Arabi's passion for Nizam, a lady he had fallen in love with. But it was through her that he reached Ishq-e-Haqiqi, the love of God. In the fever of love, separation kills. Finding her would ease the burning. Her glance, black silver flash, is fatal. Tender the bend of her neck as she turns. She extends a hand as soft as undyed silk in musk. She lets down her hair like a black snake. My heart is gone. That is the position of Abira in Qarar's life as he transcends towards Ishq-e-Haqiqi.
And the woman who bookends the novel with Abira is very different from her, isn't she?
Yes.
His journeys take him all the way to Andalusia, where he meets
another woman called Catalina. And Catalina, compared to Abira, is simple. I must give a little background about Abira. Abira is a general's daughter, brought up with all the luxury in the world. And finally, when life turns and he finds his way into Andalusia, he meets Catalina, who shows him a simpler form of love. Where dinners are not the lavish pasandas and mutton kormas, but they're just cheese and lettuce. And he finds solace in that, and how she inspires him, to find love in just being simply good, right, and doing the basics in life, which is just good, and destroying his ego.
There's love in being an internal disciple, maybe, right? Naseer Sahib, should we perhaps, if we could have another reading, and then we'll involve the audience.
I'm so sorry. There's this very beautiful passage which describes Sufism as well as I've ever heard it described. And it begins with the Qarar remembering verses of Rumi. See how in pride they go with lifted head, till fate with a sudden blow smiteth them dead. Flowers every night blossom in the sky, peace in the infinite, at peace am I. What makes the Sufi? Purity of heart, not the patched mantle and the lust perverse of the vile earthbound men who steal his name. He in all dregs discerns the essence pure, in hardship ease, in tribulation joy. A true Sufi gives all he has. These are the greatest moments. When a child's sterile mind stirs with a thirst for knowledge, because you have planted a seed there, you shall find yourself standing right there with a water canter. This is your contribution to mankind, your khidmat-e-khalq.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the conversation so far. It would be lovely to hear from you all. So if questions and brief comments, I will pick. And ladies first. Sorry to be old-fashioned.
Just wanted to ask Mir Saab, why the name Karar? Why would you call him Karar?
Great question. I'm curious too.
I know. And as Gulzar Saab had seen Nasi Saab as Mirza Ghalib, do you also see him as Karar?
Don't sell the film rights of this book, Moin.
The name Qarar, in Urdu means someone who has a sense of calm. And his life till the end is nothing other than that. And I think the journey to reach that symbolizes his entire life. So that's why the name. But might I very quickly hasten to add here that while the word qarar emerges in Urdu, its origins are in Farsi. And in Farsi, oddly enough, qarar, as they pronounce it also quite differently, qarar basically means a plan. And then the word beqarar comes from someone who doesn't have a plan and who's just rudderless. So that's how it comes into the book. Yeah. And as far as Naseer Saab is concerned, I actually see him as a ghost in a movie. The role of Shah Rezan that keeps coming in and out of the film. Shah Rezan is the Sufi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. The gentleman here in the jacket.
When Moin left Mumbai, I had a sense of beqarari. I was a little beqarar. Not only because we would go quite often to race course, but I also had the chance to have fabulous kebabs at his place. So I will have kebab later, but I'm quite happy. At that time, I was quite sad and I was mourning it that, Mir left Mumbai, but I'm glad that he left Mumbai. Had he not left, I think he would have not been able to write the fascinating book that he produced. And those of you who have not read, you must read it. I read it soon after it came. So now coming to the question, you take this character to Andalusia and you talk about the fascinating chapters that we had in history of Andalusia, and they had developed a system called convivencia, which is living, together, coexistence, and a kind of syncretic culture. What we had here, or forefathers, or framers of constitution also dreamt of having this and keeping this syncretic character of India intact. But my question to you is, do you think that it was a great loss to history and civilization when this culture of convivencia and syncretic culture of Andalusia left? It was certainly erased. And do you think that we will certainly have another disaster in India if they some elements try to kind of, erase that culture, erase that living together, that culture of coexistence and cooperation?
What happened in Andalusia was in many ways a great tragedy, where that syncretic culture that you talk about doesn't exist. there is a great, there is, when you go to Andalusia and when you walk through Cordoba and you walk through even the smallest of villages, like the one that I've mentioned, Zahara de la Sierra, there's a great sense of pride in their Moorish past. They take an enormous sense of pride in that. As far as here is concerned, no, I don't see that, because it's too deep. It's too deep and it's too beautiful. Maybe there are, there are moments of despair, but I have faith in this gorgeous and beautiful syncretic culture that you talk about in this beautiful country.
Words to live by. We have a hand at the back. Ma'am.
A personal question, Moin. You talked about returning from playing tennis with your grandfather and then attending these sort of, I don't know what you call them, soirees or whatever, some better word than that. But at what point how did it sort of come out and emerge in this manner, with this depth and this sort of, obviously you had been taking in and imbibing stuff all these years, but what was really the catalyst that really sort of erupted this in you?
My grandfather, who I used to address as Dada Huzur, would painstakingly take the time out to teach me the tenets of Sufism, almost literally, every other day. At that time, I didn't think of it as laborious, but I thought of it as more of a distraction from the daily chores. The daily, inspiring moments of the day, which was tennis, etc. But I think what really got me deeper and deeper involved into it was my regular visits to Istanbul, and my deeper understanding of Sufism came from really spending a lot of time in Turkey. And I still continue to do that, and particularly into places like Bursa, as I mentioned. And it was that moment where, not moment, but it was that passage of play, if you wish, in my life when I was visiting Turkey, almost literally every month, and it was a magnetic pull that I would just land up going there on a cheap, Ryanair or an EasyJet flight, which wouldn't cost much, and I would land up, living in not necessarily very posh places, but the moment that changed it, or actually really flung me into it, was when I met the Sufi in Bursa, and the simplicity of that man, the radiance that he had, and the simplicity of good, just simple good that struck me, was more powerful and more profound than anything that I've felt in my life. Yeah.
But you still wouldn't call yourself a Sufi?
No, by far, by far. It's a very disciplined way of life. It's quite isolating. I'm not quite that as yet, and it's you really do have to practice those tenets of Sufism, the concept of Tawheed, Takhliq by Ishq, all of that, and I don't even come close to it.
Yes, we have time for one last question. Sir, we'll hand you the mic. Sorry about that.
Ladies and gentlemen, this august panel has opened in front of us. The entire range from 0 to infinity, and such an amazing revelation. We hear of Sufi as a small child. If somebody did nothing wrong and he was a pure, this is to Sufi hai, to Sufi hai. It was the kind of understanding with which people have been brought up. And I think the philosophy has been beautifully unfolded by Moin Saab and Naseer Saab and Abel. We are really enlightened with this great revelation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
sir.
We do, in fact, have time for one last question. So, sir.
Sorry, I have not read your book, but I presume you're trying to recreate the era from 17th century and before that. How do you get comfortable that you know that time period? You read books, you read the poets. When do you say, okay, now I understand that time? What's that process like?
I don't think you really ever completely understand it. I'm still trying to understand it. I don't think you can. I can speak for myself. I don't think I can ever completely understand the true radiance of Sufism through those centuries. But yes, if as you keep reading and as you keep trying to understand, particularly the poetry, you reach a stage where you're confident enough to at least take a stab at it. And honestly, this book is nothing but just a little stab at it. You don't really understand it in entirety, but you reach a point where you can say, okay, I can have a go at this. Yeah.
And I think it is entirely to your credit that the novel is as immersive and persuasive as it is. So thank you very much for that. Thank you, Naseer Saab, for joining us and for giving new life to the lines that Moin wrote. And thank you to you all for being here. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Ria, over to you.
I'd like to thank everyone for their patience because we started a little late. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry for keeping you waiting. Sorry.
Thank you to Naseer Saab, thank you to Moin, and thank you to Supriya for making this happen. Once again, a very, very big thank you to Sula, our pouring partners this evening, and a final thank you to Kapil and Roli Books for putting this together. We hope you enjoyed this evening. We certainly did. Once again, Moin's books, The Lost Fragrance of Infinity and Surat, are right here. Please, please pick up a copy. Have the author sign it for you. And thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Naseer Saab. Thank you so much. I'm very indebted.